decade, Elona has provided adaptive support to the Dakota Presbyterian, which is a group of non-geographical Native American congregations. She's deeply involved, has been deeply involved in self-development of people, helping immigrant groups and others living on the edge develop sustainability. She's taught many classes on Native American interest, white privilege, health disparity among Blacks and Indigenous women of color. She's received numerous awards that I could go on and tell you about, and many first-time achievements. She and her husband, Reverend David Stewart, have 4 children and 4 grandchildren. They reside in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I think in Minneapolis or in St. Paul.
St. Paul.
And I will close my introduction with words that she says about herself. She said, it's been exciting to go from being in the incoming cohort of young women leading change to the historian marking the record of change. And so with that, I proudly introduce to you the moderator or co-moderator of the PCUSA. In our tradition, we would normally stand when the moderator comes in, and we do so not physically, but certainly in spirit. Welcome, Elona.
Welcome, Bonjour. It's good to join you at your annual meeting. I want to thank Jordan and Carl and Steve for this invitation. And I enjoyed the music while we were waiting to begin, so I'm looking forward to a good evening. So you've been at this work for many years. It sounds like in addition to your current history being formed as this interfaith network, you actually have about 50 years of history there in Wyoming. And I love what you said about it takes, the few dedicated people living out their faith in a public forum. That's so true. We're doing that here in Minnesota as well, both at the state level and locally. What used to be our councils of churches themselves now have gone through that transformation of becoming interfaith networks. And they're choosing to do that in order to, I think, more strategically address the issues of poverty and racial economic injustices. And so shifting now to being an interfaith group, it has made it possible for Christians and Jews, Unitarians, Muslims, Buddhists, Native Americans of a variety of tribes, and more people organized around their solidarity rather than on denominational differences. And so what we're doing is, as we commit to looking at the issues of truth-telling and reconciliation here, we're also committing to a 10-year period of time where we can also talk about repairing and healing the damage and the land loss to our Black and Indigenous communities. And we'll see in those 10 years if the term faith-based itself may even be too narrow to fulfill our commitment to justice in our ever-increasing diverse faith communities. So we want to join you and watch and learn from you because you're our neighbor to the west. My work in the Presbyterian Church for years and my community work has shown me that we all want to defeat racism. We want to end poverty. We want to raise our children's children in a world where Black lives matter, where treaties matter, and where leaders say no to oppressive security and nationalism, where the earth is protected. But in order to build communities, we have to walk carefully and deliberately down a path to repair and restore what has been broken before we can run to that goal. And that's why I've named my comments about we walk, we want to run. First, we must walk in order to discover things we would never see if we were running. James Baldwin said, "The world changes according to the way people see it. And if you alter, even by a millimeter, the way people look at reality, then you can change it." And so I want to begin by turning your attention to a statement based on hope and not fear. This is from Howard Thurman, a well-beloved theologian. It's called The Listening Ear. And if you haven't heard it, there is an audio of him saying this, which is also very exciting. But I'll read it. "Give me the listening ear, the eye that is willing to see. Give me the listening ear. I seek this day the ear that will not shrink from the word that corrects and admonishes, the word that holds up before me the image of myself that causes me to pause and reconsider, the word that challenges me to deeper consecration and higher resolve, the word that lays bare needs that make my own days uneasy, that seizes upon every good, decent impulse of my nature, channeling it into paths of healing in the lives of others. Give me the listening ear. I seek this day the disciplined mind, the disciplined heart, the disciplined life that makes my ear the focus of attention, through which I may become mindful of expressions of life foreign to my own. I seek the stimulation that lifts me out of old ruts and established habits, which keep me near conscious of myself, my needs, and my personal interest. Give me this day the eye that is willing to see the meaning of the ordinary, the familiar, the commonplace, the eye that is willing to see my own faults for what they are, the eye that is willing to see the likable qualities in those I may not like, the mistake in what I thought was correct, the strength in what I had labeled as weakness. Give me the eye that is willing to see that thou hast not left thyself without a witness in every living thing, and thus to walk with reverence and sensitiveness through all the days of my life. Give me the listening ear, the eye that is willing to seek. I am so grateful for Black theologians like Howard Thurman. That was written about 100 years ago. And so much of what he expressed in that also shares the teachings of, our Native American medicine wheel. It's all about awareness and balance and purpose and respect. Now, we can't talk about justice if we can't imagine a truth and reconciliation process. And we can't speed through this righteous repair to intervene in the oppression of people and the exploitation of land. So how should we engage in the real trauma and tragedy of centuries of injustice? We're called to build integrity in our relationships by creating trust. And when we care about people, we form trust, and trust builds hope. Think of hope as a genuine gift of purpose directed beyond ourselves towards the next generation, the next 7 generations. Right now, it feels like hope is buried beneath the pandemic, but it will rise. And so what is hope? It is there in the solidarity of truth-telling about the brokenness of our communities. When we repent what caused the real loss and pain deep in the core of our humanity, when we walk together as faith communities, and when we offer restoration together, then I think we can proclaim hope. And I'm just not talking about our recent losses. We know that it's been very difficult to go through the COVID virus and all the limitations on our time and our space and our gatherings. But I want to talk about the ancient and enduring losses that surround us like a haunting shadow affecting us even before we understand what it is. Hope has to be held in a creative tension with truth. As we summon healing and wholeness and belonging, we must be actively engaged with our communities to break down the systems and the practices and the ideologies that underlie all the discrimination and bias and prejudice and oppression of people. And if we want to change laws, policies, and plans and social structures that perpetuate exploitation, we have to do that by being engaged. So during these COVID and racism pandemics, I think we're also seeing real demographic and social change here in this country and around the world. And they're accompanied by media and political narratives that message fear, hate speech, and acts of violence. But we can't run around it. We must continue to walk straight through it if we're actually going to repudiate it. And I recall some years ago, John Powell, who was the director of the Haas Institute for Fair and Inclusive Societies, said that the opposite of racism is belonging. And boy, does that have deep meaning in defining the fear of who is the other. That fear is especially dangerous if we retrench into our historic systems that have been firmly embedded with racist privilege without creating greater participation and representation, shared power, and value. If we're going to reach out and engage in interfaith dialogue, we must courageously transform dis- and misinformation into inclusive policies. We need to decolonize our practices, and we need to invite those of diverse traditions to rebuild our structures together so that we can welcome belonging into the center of all of our relationships. It's not easy. It's going to be a challenge to open up space and to wrestle with our history, our purpose, and the source of our social capital in whose institutions there's been systems of privilege hoarded on this continent since the doctrine of discovery 500 years ago. Successful advocacy reflects the necessary repair, though, of our fragmentation from each other and the Creator. It is time to combat racism and to reimagine and repair and retool and reward and redistribute and reinvest in hope. So I'm thankful for your theme. We need to invite direct input from a broad inclusion of Indigenous, Black, and other people of color to inform political outreach, to work on development strategies and reshape family services, to talk about new financial investments, to set up lead architecture in new ways. You know, these are all those unexpected places outside of just talking about racial ethnic communities where our wisdom as Black, Indigenous, and people of color and our expertise is very much needed. And unless we confess how much we have misused the gifts that the Creator gave us, we're going to continue to break our relationship with others. We'll continue to perpetuate our fears by blaming victims for the injustices they suffer. And when we focus on things like poverty and citizenship status, language other than English, our out-of-control protest, and protection of property, we will also fail to examine the root causes of oppression and alienation. We really have to do better. We have to speak boldly about necessary reparative steps. Those reconciling, I love these R words, reconciling and repairing and redeeming acts every time we now acknowledge whatever Indigenous homeland there is where we gather to meet or work. We have to be aware how other marginalized people are always watching and interpreting these actions in their oral histories. I can't tell you how many times immigrants new to America have a different understanding of what has happened when they arrived here that most national figures and elected leaders have never heard. And we have to continue the work of liberation. But we also have to remember, like the line in that great song, Glory, that says, justice for all just isn't specific enough. And neither is the phrase, welcome to all. We need to learn how to engage in hard conversations, the courageous conversations, the uncomfortable conversations to combat racism and restore hope. Given the urgency of what we witness in our communities and on our streets today, it's important that we determine who actually is benefiting, who bears the cost, and what is bigger than ourselves and what we can change right now. It's critical to trace our steps back to the moral principles and the covenants of a promised hope here in this very place. Sometimes it means simply standing and listening to the unabridged voices of those who have been marginalized and disenfranchised, and who may not want to engage in your transformation, or to manage white people's fragility, or to lead the conversion of our systems and our behavior. So here are two lenses that I want to share with you. These are unabridged statements to the question of moving toward being anti-racist if you want to become an ally. The first is from a Black voice, an African-American fellow that has said, you know, all these initiatives that everybody wants to commit to now, including those around creating, equitable conversations or statements of resolution that have to be acted upon by some municipal government, or proclamations that are to be written and read in the paper, or changing the name of our streets, or swapping pulpits, or having diversity dinners and equity talks. If they're not clearly and intentionally focused on dismantling white supremacy, then those things are just simply distractions. They're empty actions that may have nothing to do with really bringing about the liberation of Black people in our cities. And for Indigenous folk, they may further serve to be projects of assimilation or extermination. Wow. And here's a message from one of my Dakota friends. Gabby has said, I understand that there is often great openness with which our Native culture and spirituality is shared. I understand that this has a positive impact on white people that join us. And that is a good feeling that you enjoy and you're attracted to come with us with a responsibility, though, and a struggle. Don't try to understand our culture without understanding our struggle. Put your prayers to action just like the rest of us. We don't have a choice, and as far as I'm concerned, neither do you. If you're showing up for our ceremonies, show up for us in all other ways. We don't need any more cultural hitchhikers. Be a true ally and an accomplice. And for those that do, we will see you and appreciate you. I wanted to share those words directly from friends of mine, because we know it's going to take more than, one book, one conference, one march, one group, one all-night conversation, or, things like that to bring about the change that is needed. People really do want to do something, but they don't know what that is. And even if they knew what it was, they don't know how. It's going to require action by everybody in all of our identities and relationships, and it has to be reinforced by our commitment to create real, tangible transformation. I believe that's what our ancestors expected, and that, I believe, is what we should expect of ourselves and what we need to expect of others. So remember to walk. don't run. And what are some of the steps we need to take on our walk together? This is from a list from a cluster of statements around white allies talking to other white people. The first is to listen more and resist responding with a better insight that may silence or displace other voices. Don't explain stuff that we've been experiencing for 500 years. Black, Indigenous, and people of color have been aware of systemic violence and devaluing because it's so inherent in systemic racism. It's been there for centuries. So it's important to see and comprehend what you've been ignoring if you're going to be determined to dismantle racism. It took 500 years. It won't be done overnight. We also say engage where and whatever you have been avoiding without expressing statements like, I can't believe something like this would happen in this day and age. We've all heard people say that. You know, I live very near the Capitol here in St. Paul. And it was unbelievable how walking on the sidewalk, people would just say, I can't believe people are protesting, or I can't believe those statues have been there, or I can't believe that, you know, police brutality is so obvious. Yes, believe it. Begin to engage in those realities. The fourth step, in order to offer hope, we must do the very deep, hard work of transformation, restoration, and reparation. Martin Luther King said it, Standing Cloud said it, Wilma Mankiller said it, David Mura said it, Sheila White Eagle said it, Gajwa Gong Tao here in St. Paul has said it, Dolores Huerta said it. They all hoped that we would pay attention to doing the deep, hard work of transformation. And then this new voice today, Courtney, who has written all these statements about white allies, she says it like this: privilege means you owe a debt. You inherit it. You probably didn't ask for it, and you probably didn't pay for it either. No one's blaming you for having it. You're lovely, human, and amazing. Being a citizen of a society requires work from everyone within that society. And so it's up to you whether you choose to acknowledge the work that is yours to do. It's up to you whether you choose to pay this debt and how you choose to do so. It may mean marching or writing a story, building a shelter, changing bank policies, offering legal assistance, or modeling Wakanjwa Kin Wakampi, which in Dakota is from the phrase, our children are sacred. But it's an initiative that allows us to be equipped to intervene and resolve conflict in public spaces for the sake of our children. This is very sacred work. Truth and justice require a great deal of work. Doesn't need an audience. It just needs your conviction, our evolution, and our country's revolution. So when is it a good time to start? Well, now is the right time, because durable hope will always be sufficient to combat racism through your interfaith work. So thank you for all you do. Miigwech, and I appreciate this chance to join you at your annual event.
Thank you so much, Elona, for your wise words and just your presence here tonight. It's very much appreciated, and we're all very grateful to have you. Do you have time? I know it's 4:35. Do you have time for a few questions? Oh, sorry, you're muted.
Now, and yes, I do.
Okay.
I was just waiting to get unmuted.
All right. Well, everybody, you can submit your questions through the chat box. We just ask you to do this just for the ease of Zoom etiquette and everything. So We do have a question from one of our board members, Roger McDaniel, and he asks, where do you see white supremacy in the church and how can it be dismantled?
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, as an Indigenous person, Christianity arrived here at the same time that the doctrine of discovery was shaping the whole time of discovery, exploration, the misappropriation and extraction of resources, and the annihilation of Indigenous people. So in the process of those explorers who were Christian coming to these new lands, they committed on behalf of the Christian monarchs that they represented to perpetual exploitation and enslavement of the Indigenous people. And then as they moved from the various locations in the Caribbean and other nations in Europe began to say, you know, this is a good thing we have going on. It still came in the name of the church. And when I say it, I mean settlers, colonization, empire, gold and profit, and more military violence. So where do I see white supremacy? From the very foundation of churches settling here and claiming this land for their people as a promised land, even though for us, it was our home. Over time, as the church evolved, all of the debates and discussions that were going on meant that those debates and discussions were still happening at the time that Native people were being displaced. And within, 100 or so more years, the enslavement of Indigenous people from Africa. And so the sale of Indian people to buy Black bodies from Africa was still part of church work. And so even as we look at our confessional statements and we look at the promises that we have made around liberty and justice, a sense of grace that none of us really truly deserve from a creator that is omnipotent, we know that there is veiled in that a sense of white supremacy, that whiteness is equal to civilization and everyone else was a heathen, a savage, or not even human. And Chief Standing Bear, the Supreme Court case with him, which was held after the Civil War, that determined at the Supreme Court level that Native people were actually human. So this again is the church being able to say, we are the witness of Jesus Christ and we are the body of Christ who was broken to save people and restore them, to a holy relationship. But in the meanwhile, at the same time, those voices are coming from an institution that, as I say, was hoarding white supremacy, injustices in the name of civilization and monarchs and empire. I'm Christian. My people have been Christian as Delaware people, since colonial times. And I have to walk in those worlds of understanding what it means to be a Christian who sees the words of Jesus Christ as good medicine for our people. Oh my, wonderful medicine. But at the same time, I have to be frank and honest that it was the church also that tried to destroy us. And so this is a very serious question about where is white supremacy in the church and how would we dismantle it? We need to be able to say that many of the mainline denominations are anywhere from 80 to 93% white. So what do we do about our membership? Where is it that we create churches? Do we imagine that it's like the game, baseball game in Iowa where we create this building and people will come and worship up? We need to be able to say, why aren't we worshiping in those Black congregations? Why aren't we worshiping with Native people in their ways? We also need to be able to make sure that our investment programs and our property sales and all that we're doing with our money can now reflect a more just world and an understanding of the need to repair the brokenness that was caused by the church. In all of our preparations, we need to make sure then that we have more people around the table talking. It would have been nice if 400 and some years ago, we had Christianity 101, you know, and in the seminar, people had a chance to talk, but we didn't do that. But it's still never too late, because we have Indigenous theologians and spiritual leaders, as well as others around the world, that really will enhance our understanding of our relationships to each other and to the Creator. And then we can begin to say the churches and the faith communities and the sacred sites where people have worshiped and honored their spirituality for years, that those things can truly be revered and respected, and it'll be of value to all of us. So that's my long answer to that question, but it's very complicated.
It is. Well, thank you for that. And we have a couple more, and then we'll probably just get to these two, and then that'll be our time. So we have one from Dara Perez, and she asks, how are others coming to terms with the understanding of the trauma placed within Indigenous communities? And how does this impact non-Indigenous individuals?
Well, you know, I've spent years being an educator, and I served on a school board of the largest school district here in the state of Minnesota, and I've done a lot of work around children and brain development and early childhood education, maternal issues, nutrition. Those things are all related to intergenerational trauma. It can be passed on through our DNA. And we now know, with all of the research around how a child's brain forms, we know that the ACE inhibitors, the adverse childhood experiences, and if you, out of a list of 9, if a child has experienced anywhere from 5 to 7, it literally means that their brain, the development of their brain has been impacted. So issues around cognitive development, decision-making, the perception that they have of the world will change. So when we talk about, as Native people, the boarding school experience, genocide, the people are concerned now about the pandemic and what it means to not be able to get in your car and go where you want and to have your calendar changed. Well, imagine if you were Indigenous people as refugees, seeing the entire world change, and not just for a couple months, but for 3 and 4 and 5 centuries of that. Then that's where we begin to say that the matters of intergenerational trauma are real. They are being studied. They're being addressed. They have formed all aspects of mental health and therapy and childhood education. And it affects not just Indigenous people, it affects all people, because again, it is the way our brains are formed when they are put under stress. So I think this is an exciting time to be able to look at the science around brain development and mental health services. And if we could just walk with each other to be able to say we need culturally specific, readily accessible, and affordable mental health care, so that we could restore people to who they truly need to be, that really is a promise of hope. So thank you.
So we'll have this as our last question for you. And our friend Mohammed asks, Indigenous people that live on reservations are forgotten since the struggle is fought often in urban areas. How do we bring them into this struggle that has affected them for centuries?
Well, thank you, Mohammed, because you have just touched on the reality of being Native. We are invisible in plain sight. You know, we always say there are Indians all around you every day, but people just don't see us. So there are many Native people on reservations. There are people who spend time off the reservation in, you know, the local towns or in cities because of jobs. and then they will go back during different times of the year. But all Native people are invisible because we can look like anybody. We don't fit the stereotype that people have about us. And the reality of those experiences, whether they're on the res or in the communities, people again just don't see us with census information or any other data that your municipality collects. We're ignored, you know, because we're either numerically insignificant on the data set, you know, that's being measured. I noticed that, you know, in Wyoming, just like in many other places, your largest racial ethnic student population is Hispanic. That's almost 3 times your white population is 3 times all of the racial ethnic populations. But for Native people, it's even much smaller. It's about 2 to 1%. But many of those identified as Hispanic have Native origins. So again, how do we recognize that Native people are infused all over this country? I think another matter that we need to recognize is that the strong energy forces that came out of the National Indian Education Association, the National Congress of American Indians, the American Indian Movement, Honor the Earth right now with some of the land reclamation. Persons involved in that, the leaders involved in that, are people who live in all of those worlds. Urban, reservation, off the reservation, they live in corporate offices, and oftentimes they're out doing a Sundance or hunting throughout other times of the year. But it means that we must always be able to stand together and be recognized. My people on the East Coast, you know, when I was growing up, people would say, well, you know, what are you? Are you Hispanic? Are you Puerto Rican? You know, are you Black? And we would say, well, we're Native, you know, we're Delaware Nanticoke. And people would honestly say to us as children, you can't be Indian because all the Indians around here are dead. You know, when you say that to a child, it just has erased your entire family, all the people that, you know, the people that look exactly like you, who have your name. And so, Mohammed, I thank you for your question, because around the world, Indigenous people meet and gather on all the continents, making sure that we are able to revitalize our languages, that we are able to express our spiritual nature, that we talk about our human rights and our civil rights under, you know, various doctrines, even at the United Nations for Indigenous people. So we're organized and we're working. Even where poverty is so high, health disparities are so high, in the midst of all of that, we will continue to be resilient and indomitable because the Creator has placed us in the world with our feet still on the ground as a reminder that we have a relationship with the earth, and that's whether it's on these continents here or around the world. And I know we just enjoy being in conversations with Indigenous people elsewhere to talk about your language and your family kinship systems, your food supplies, and the teachings that you bring to the world. So let's keep doing that. And Mohammed, I would hope that, you know, there might be a chance where you and I maybe could talk across the table with Indigenous people there in Wyoming and your community as well. I would love that.